Next to speak is Kristin Valentino from the Department of Psychology here at Notre Dame. Kristin joined the faculty here in 2009, where she was named the William J. Shaw Center for Children and Families Collegiate Chair. Kristin received her PhD in 2007 from the University of Rochester under Dante Cicchetti. She served as a postdoctoral fellow for 2 years at the Yale Child Study Center after that. Kristin is interested in how the integration of biological, psychological, and environmental factors can inform our understanding of the development of memory and self among maltreated children. Guiding her research is a developmental psychopathology perspective, which emphasizes the interface between normal and atypical development. Kristin utilizes a levels of analysis approach toward the study of child development and child psychopathology. In addition, Kristin is interested in the transition of developmental research into interventions for maltreated children and their families. Recent publications appear in Developmental Review, Developmental Psychology, Child Development, Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, and Journal of Traumatic Stress. Please join me in welcoming Kristin.
Thanks for that nice welcome, Julie. So today I'm going to be focusing my talk broadly on the role of early mother-child interactions on child development, as many of us have been talking about. And so first, I am going to be sharing with you some of my basic research on mother-child play and child maltreatment, and we'll discuss how the analysis of play during the first 2 years of life can really inform us about children's developing cognitive and social skills. And then second, I'm going to discuss some applications of this research into the clinical realm, where I'll present some new research from my lab, where we've been working on translating some of these basic research findings on early parent-child interactions into an intervention for young maltreated children. So as you've already heard from other presenters, play is a very important component of the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. The context of play really enables children to create and explore a world that they can master, and then within this context, they can learn, develop, and practice innovative behaviors and social competencies. Play also occurs across multiple species, and typically this happens during the juvenile period of development, as long as the environment is safe and familiar. So we know that humans in particular have a very long or extended juvenile period relative to other species, and we really rely heavily on parents to provide this safety in order for children to successfully play. Now, for the most part, parents are able to provide this kind of basic, average, expected environment for their children. However, in contrast, child maltreatment represents a very extreme failure of the early caregiving environment. So the comparison then of children from maltreating and non-maltreating families represents a unique experiment of nature that really allows us to evaluate the contribution of early caregiving to young children's developing play, and then more broadly, their developing cognitive and social skills. So in other words, unlike research that utilizes animal models, with humans we're really ethically unable to experimentally manipulate early caregiving practices, nor would we want to. So analysis of children from maltreating and non-maltreating families who are matched on all other demographic variables provides us with a really important opportunity to be able to disentangle the effects of early caregiving on child development. So beyond play being an important component of the EEA, play is also a really ideal context for research. Because play requires children to really integrate all of their developing skills, so integrate their cognitive skills, motivational, emotional, and social, and because it doesn't necessarily rely on children's verbal skills, mother-child play in particular is a central observational context for examining both child development and parental behavior in very young children. Now, in terms of play structure, children's play complexity follows a very predictable progression which evolves from just undifferentiated exploration to more sensory motor play, where kids are picking up objects, looking at them, turning them over, really just engaged with things, to the most advanced level, which would be pretend fantasy play. And this progression has received extensive empirical support both with typically developing children and with atypically developing children. So for example, if you follow children with Down syndrome, you'll still see this same emergence, although it might be a little bit delayed. And overall, it's very highly correlated with children's increasing cognitive capacity. Similarly, social progression occurs in children's play during the first few years of life. So it evolves from play that starts out to be very solitary and moves toward play that's more cooperative and involves others as play partners. Now, on the other side, children's non-social and disengaged activity during play may be cause for concern. So in research with preschool-age children looking at play during play with peers, those who engage in non-play or look at other children and hang back, don't participate in the play themselves, are higher in social fearfulness. And those who really engage in a lot of solitary behavior without including others in their play also tend to be more impulsive, immature, and poor in emotion regulation. Little is known, however, about non-play behavior during the context of mother-child play. And this is important, really considering how parents are typically children's first play partners. Despite the richness of play as a context to really evaluate children's cognitive and social development, very few studies have examined the play behaviors of maltreated and non-maltreated children. The studies that do exist have primarily focused on the peer play of maltreated children during the preschool age. And the take-home message from this research is that already by ages 4 and 5, maltreated children are engaging in less overall play. They spend more time in off-task behavior. Their play is less complex, so it's got a lower cognitive level compared to their non-maltreated peers. And then if we look at the thematic differences that emerge in their pretend play, maltreated children tend to be more imitative of everyday routines and less fantasy-based in their play than do non-maltreated children. So overall, these findings are suggesting that by the preschool years, maltreated children already demonstrate deficits or delays in cognitive, play maturity, and social competence. But we don't know much about the development of these differential play behaviors prior to the preschool years or the factors that might account for these differences. So one of the goals of my research has been to examine the mother-child play of children from maltreating and non-maltreating families during infancy and toddlerhood, and in the context of play with their mothers. More broadly, infant social behavior also develops dramatically across the first 2 years of life. In particular, child social behavior shifts from responding or reacting to the environment to having the capacity to initiate social interactions. So if we look at socio-communicative abilities, in particular between 9 and 15 months of age, there's a progression from being able to just share attention with others, so that joint attention ability, which then progresses to the ability to imitate the actions of others. And then finally, towards being able to direct others' attention and behavior. So being able to point to something and have mom look at it, ask mom a question. All of those things emerge towards around 15 months of age. Moreover, in the second year of life, a couple of critical child socio-emotional achievements include the development of an autonomous self and representations of self and other as intentional agents. And these tasks are accomplished in part by making requests and attending to how caregivers respond to you. So two central aspects of children's social competence from infancy to toddlerhood are children's increased capacity for initiating or directing social exchanges and their ability to respond to parental requests. And in fact, child initiations have been used across a wide variety of studies as a prime indicator of social competence. So in our longitudinal research, we've been interested in examining how a maltreating family environment might affect infants and toddlers' social behavior through an evaluation of child initiating and responding during play interactions with their moms. So of course, parents have a critical role in influencing child play and developing social and communicative behaviors. By making themselves more available for play and by being active play partners, parents directly influence the maturity and enthusiasm of their children's play. And additionally, parents' ability to direct their child's attention to objects and events in the environment teaches children how to gain control over and focus their attention. And this is a really critical skill then for being able to initiate and maintain self-directed exploration on their own. Research, however, from studies of maltreating moms with their preschool-age children reveals significant deficits in these attention-direction behaviors. In particular, they tend to use fewer verbal and physical attention-directing strategies during play with their preschool-age kids. However, like I've been saying, we don't know much about this attention-directing behavior during infancy or toddlerhood. Now, as toddlers are striving for this autonomous functioning, we want them, to be able to engage in this self-directed play and exploration. The way that caregivers respond to those bids for autonomy with sensitivity and tolerance is really necessary for successful resolution of this stage salient task. If caregivers are not supportive or are unable to set age-appropriate limits, then this tends to thwart the emergence of autonomy in children. And indeed, studies of parent-child interactions reveal a number of maladaptive strategies used by maltreating parents in particular. So maltreating moms tend to lack the ability to set age-appropriate limits or even know what the age-appropriate limits are. They tend to be more negative, inconsistent, and more controlling in their interactions with their young children. And so a final goal of this longitudinal research was to see how maternal interaction style might differ between maltreating and non-maltreating families, and then how this would affect infants' progression of social behavior. Given this background literature, I examined mother-child play from infants from maltreating and non-maltreating families starting in infancy and tracked them through toddlerhood. And we hypothesized, first in terms of child play structure, so this is looking at the cognitive complexity of children's play, that the infants from the maltreating families would have lower cognitive levels of play, and that these infants would also have delays in the development or emergence of social behavior. Looking at the maternal social behavior, we also thought that maltreating moms would exhibit less limit setting and fewer verbal and physical attention direction behaviors, and that these maternal behaviors are going to influence the effect of maltreatment on child behaviors during play. So to do the study, at time one, we started out with 130 infants and their moms who were approximately 12 months of age. 78 of them were from maltreating families and 52 from non-maltreating families. And then we tracked them for about a year. And at time two, there were 78 dyads who still participated in the study. So that's a pretty significant drop in participation rate, but unfortunately, that's not all that uncommon in research with this type of population. Luckily, there were not significant differences between those who continued to participate and those who did not. Our maltreating families actually were recruited directly from the Department of Child Services, and our comparison families were recruited from families receiving public assistance. So you can just see here briefly that our maltreating and non-maltreating families were similar on a variety of demographic characteristics. They were predominantly single-parent homes, large representation of ethnic minorities, and highly disadvantaged socioeconomically. In terms of our maltreating families, all of the dyads from maltreating families were comprised of biological mothers with their children. So because we were so interested in this interaction between moms and children, we excluded children who were currently in foster care. And for all maltreating families, mothers were named as a perpetrator of the maltreatment. We then classified children's maltreatment experiences using a well-validated maltreatment classification system where we looked at the actual child welfare records and then coded them for the presence or absence of various maltreatment subtypes. So those could include sexual abuse, physical neglect, and emotional maltreatment. And what we found, which is common with maltreating populations, that there's very high comorbidity of subtypes, so it's rare to have just one type of maltreatment experience. And so because neglect in particular was so pervasive in our sample, we decided to divide the maltreating families into families where there had been abuse or physical or sexual abuse, regardless of neglect. and then families where there was neglect but no physical or sexual abuse. So this research actually was part of a larger study that involved other paradigms and measures, but the ones that we're focusing here on this study are 2 play paradigms. One was just a language-free play where moms were in a room with their children, they're being videotaped, and they had a wide variety of age-appropriate toys and just told, play with your child like you would typically play at home. They also participated in another play paradigm where there were slightly different instructions for other 10-minute segments, but the middle segment of that play paradigm also had told moms, you're unrestricted in your play, just play like you would at home. And so altogether we had about 25 minutes of play to code. And then we additionally administered all of the infants the Bayley scales of infant development so that we could co-vary cognitive functioning. In terms of how we coded the play behaviors, we first coded them for the structure of children's play. So this is getting at the cognitive complexity of what children did. And these play codes have been adapted from codes that others have used with a variety of populations. The most simple play is just putting a toy in your mouth, so it'd be mouthing, moving on to simple manipulation where you're just looking at toys and turning it over, moving all the way up into play complexity. And what we did was divide the videotaped interactions into 15-second intervals and code for the most complicated thing that children were able to do during each 15-second period. So unfortunately, I do not have a videotape of the kids participating in the research that I'm presenting, but I do have access to lots of child-infant play videos. So, whoops. See if I can get this to work. All right, it's a little dark, but this is Lily, who is my daughter. And you can see that she's hanging on to a little plastic thing of grapes and just holding it and looking at it and turning it over. So this would be characteristic of simple manipulation, which is pretty common as the predominant thing that young infants do during their play. And then eventually she's going to pick up another toy and start banging them together. And this would be an example of relational play, so bringing 2 objects together, not necessarily using them in a purposeful way, but is considered to be a little more cognitively complex than just simple manipulation. All right, so that's play structure. And then we also coded for the mother and child social behavior. So we adapted the codes that had been used in previous maltreatment research to look at this maternal attention directing behavior. So on the mom side, we coded things like how often did they give instructions or ask questions, how often did they name objects in their environment. So these are all verbal attention directing strategies. How often were they limit setting? How often were they doing things like pointing to toys, demonstrating how to use a toy, actually physically moving their child's hands through the motions of playing with something. And then we coded child responses to these things. So whether the child was just simply attending to what mom was doing, if the child was able to imitate, if the child engaged in social referencing, so maybe the child would play with something on their own, not including mom, but then look up and check in to see how mom was reacting to what they were doing, or possibly if the child was pointing to a toy, repositioning, demonstrating how to do something for mom. We used these same codes at time 2, except obviously children were capable of doing a lot more by the time they were 26 months of age. So we added a couple of additional codes to really capture their verbal behavior in particular. So verbal attention directing, things like the child asking questions, giving mom instructions, naming things, and also child's negative reactivity to mom, so ignoring mom or really resisting mom. Now, unlike the other codes, these we also did in 15-second intervals, but multiple categories of behavior could be coded within each time period. So all of that yielded a lot of data. So just to summarize how we kind of broke it down, in terms of play structure, we looked at how much time they spent engaged in non-play, what their average play, so what type of play did they spend the most time in, and what was the maximum level of play that they achieved. In terms of maternal social behavior, we decided to collapse the verbal categories all into just one big verbal attention directing strategy, looked at limit setting and physical behaviors. And then for children, we had attending, imitating, and then we also put the social referencing and child initiating, pointing, and demonstrating things together into a child-independent variable. All things that characterize children being able to do stuff or starting to initiate their own interactions without mom's support. And then at time 2, we used very similar variables. For play structure, they were identical. For maternal social behavior, we actually ended up doing a factor analysis on the variables and found that it was better to have just 2 variables than 3, and found that maternal verbal attention directing or physically pointing and demonstrating things actually cohered better as conceptually scaffolding child behavior, whereas mom's limit setting or physically moving child's hands through the motions of something were considered controlling. So we labeled that factor. And then for child social behaviors, we looked at imitation again. We looked at initiating behaviors again, which now includes asking moms questions, so all that verbal attention directing behavior, and then of course their negative reactivity. And so turning to the data, what we found was first looking at child play structure at time 1, so when these babies were 12 months of age, we did not find an effect of maltreatment subtype. So across all 3 groups of infants, the most common level of play was simple manipulation. But we thought, at a pretty basic level of play, we might just be having floor effects, and at time 2, we still expect maybe this is when differences will emerge. But at time 2, we also found the same thing, no group differences. But what was striking was that across all of these infants or toddlers now, only 51% engaged in any pretend play, whereas research with more typically developing families, middle-class families, has suggested that by 24 months of age, which is even a little bit younger than the children that we were looking at, virtually all children engage in pretend play. So this kind of just really speaks to how impoverished the whole sample was, and that is reflected in their play as well. But turning to child social behavior, at time 1, we did find a multivariate effect of child social behavior. And so breaking that down into the variables that went into that analysis, looking at imitation here, we see that the children from abusing families actually engaged in more imitation than the non-maltreating families. And looking at independent behavior, we see that these infants from abusing families engaged in less independent behavior than both the neglecting and the non-maltreating families. So considering that developmental progression from being able to imitate others to then being able to initiate your own interactions, direct others' attention, we interpreted these differences in infant behavior at time 1 as kind of evidence that infants from abusing families were delayed in the progression of their social behaviors. So at time 2, we were looking to see if this pattern persisted, and in fact it did. There were no differences anymore in terms of imitation, but when we looked at child-initiated behavior, we still see that the children from abusing families are engaging in significantly less child-initiated behavior during play with their moms than both the neglecting and the non-maltreating families. In terms of maternal behavior at time 1, we did find a significant multivariate effect having to do with maltreatment subtype, and this was predominantly driven by differences in maternal verbal interaction behavior. So moms from abusing families were engaging in fewer verbal attention directing strategies than did the non-maltreating families. There was also a trend that moms were engaging in, from abusing families, were engaging in a little bit less limit setting than the non-maltreating families. But looking at time 2, the differences between moms on these behaviors were no longer apparent. However, there still seems to be some enduring effects of these differences in early maternal attention directing on children's subsequent behavior. So a last set of analyses looked at longitudinal predictors of our primary child social behavior outcome variables. And when focusing on child-initiated behavior, we found that children's cognitive scores from time 1, so that Bailey assessment that I mentioned was a positive predictor of child initiation, which we would expect because being able to initiate your own interactions is cognitively more complex. Child abuse was a negative predictor of these behaviors. And then also time 1 and time 2 maternal physical behaviors, so physical behaviors and then those controlling behaviors at time 2 were each unique predictors, so that the more moms did these things, the less children initiated behavior during mother-child play at time 2. In terms of child negative reactivity, we found that infants' cognitive skills were negatively predictive of that. So the children who had more negative reactivity were the ones who performed the worst on the cognitive assessment. And then interestingly, that time 1 child imitation, which we saw had been elevated in the infants from abusing families, was predictive of more negative reactivity at time 2. So again, I think this signals that imitation that we were seeing among the young maltreated, among the young infants from abusing families in particular, was not particularly adaptive for them at that time. So what this research really shows us is, in terms of child cognitive development and the structural complexity of children's play, no differences emerged among the children from abusing, neglecting, and non-maltreating families during infancy or toddlerhood. And these findings are actually pretty consistent with an accumulating body of research on maltreatment and cognitive processes, which is showing that maltreatment might not affect the development of very basic cognitive skills. So you could see this in the development of visual self-recognition, for example, or some basic memory processes. And as an important aspect of the EEA, it is possible that the cognitive aspects of play are so highly canalized that they're not readily susceptible to the adverse effects of maltreatment within the first years of life. But although maltreatment does not impede basic cognitive processes, several studies have shown the adverse effects of maltreatment on child social and emotional development. And so consistent with that, we did find that children from abusing families demonstrated less independent play and more imitative play than did infants from non-maltreating families. And then furthermore, this pattern persisted into toddlerhood. So this represents, kind of the earliest actually developmental indication of a difference in self-other differentiation and social competence that we have documented for young maltreated children. And then because child initiations during play have been identified as a primary marker of social competence, our findings are really highlighting that children from abusing families are already engaging in less socially competent behavior, and underscores the disruption in normative social development that an abusive family context can create. So in this abusive family environment, you could imagine how it might actually be adaptive to engage in less autonomous behavior. So it might be a good idea when interacting with a caregiver who could respond to your bids with unpredictable or dangerous behavior, to engage in less of that, or to imitate them in the hopes of receiving a more positive response. And so we actually could conceptualize this reduction in child-initiated play as an experience-dependent adaptation to avoid further abuse experience. And this kind of experience-dependent hypothesis, I think, is further supported by the lack of differences in child-initiated play that we saw between the children in neglecting families and those from non-maltreating families. Because although the children from neglecting families have lacked sufficient caregiving to meet their basic physical or emotional needs, they haven't experienced the commission of abuse or the accompanying fear that likely brings with it. So which is what may have motivated the children from abusing families to refrain from this social initiation. And then more broadly, our findings are consistent with an evolutionary perspective on play, such as surplus resource theory, which has argued that young children really rely on this safety and provisioning provided by a parent during this period to explore their environment and learn skills necessary for successful functioning in adulthood. So when resources are not adequate, and especially if conditions are not safe, but are rather stressed, play is not going to be optimal. So whereas these deviations in autonomous behavior during infancy and toddlerhood might have been adaptive for young children from abusing families in the context of mother-child play. We can imagine how this is not going to be adaptive anymore in other contexts, such as engaging in play with peers. And indeed, it might impede the development of future relationships. In terms of maternal interaction style, we saw that at time 1, moms from abusing families in particular showed fewer verbal attention directing behaviors and less limit setting than with their children compared to the moms from the non-maltreating families. And there was a similar pattern at time 2, although those results weren't significant. And so one thing that I think is important to continue to look at is the analysis of the content rather than just the frequency of these maternal social behaviors, as it might shed further light on potential differences in this maternal behavior as children develop past infancy. Nonetheless, we know that early maternal verbal attention directing and verbal input plays a really critical role in children's developing social competence. And so this decreased verbal behavior of moms from abusing families in particular may continue to be relevant for children's subsequent development. So in terms of future work, specifically looking at play, I think it'll be important to clarify the content of maternal play behavior even further. Especially regarding maternal verbal behavior, several studies have shown that maternal elaboration or maintenance of things that children initiated during play is positively associated with child social competence, whereas redirection of that is not. So it'd be helpful for us to look for in the future at differentiating maternal behavior, in distinguishing interactions that are elaborative or maintaining versus those that are redirecting, and then also between those that are positive and negative in valence. And then additionally, I think it's important to clarify our findings regarding maternal physical play and later child development. So as you might remember, across all of the dyads in this research, time 1 maternal physical play was negatively associated with later child-initiated behavior. And so although our codes for child physical play included things like physically moving children's hands through the motions of playing with a toy, and not rough and tumble play specifically, I can't help but wonder how to reconcile some of these findings with the work on father-child physical play and child development. So some of you might remember from this conference 2 years ago when Flanders presented on father-child rough and tumble play, and he found that as long as fathers were establishing dominance during this physical rough and tumble play, that it was very beneficial for children's later emotion regulation. So, I think this raises a number of interesting questions. First is whether father-child and mother-child physical play operates the same or differently. And then another question is, what about in single-parent families? Like, can moms fulfill this role for rough and tumble or physical play in the absence of a dad? So I think that's all, important work for the future. And then this work also has a number of clinical implications. We see that already within the first 2 years of life that maltreated children are at risk for deviations in social development. And so this really highlights, I think, the importance of intervening early. So what is really needed is translational research that can use our basic research and our knowledge of risk and protective factors to inform the development of evidence-based interventions for maltreated children in particular. And so, one takeaway message from this play research is that it might, in fact, be important to improve maternal interactions, including targeting maternal verbal behavior. Broadly, just want to argue why maltreatment is important and we should be thinking about interventions for that. This is a huge problem in our society. So there's close to 1 million victims of child abuse or neglect annually, and 6 times as many are investigated by Child Protective Services. And really underscoring the role of parents in these maltreatment experiences, 82% of victims are maltreated by their parents. What's even more alarming is that risk for abuse and neglect is the greatest for children who are under age 5. And then if we think about what is probably clearly the most horrible outcome associated with maltreatment, which would be child fatality, 78% of those fatalities occur for children who are 3 and younger, and 90% are children who are 7 and younger. So we certainly need to direct our intervention efforts towards young children in particular. It's not only prevalent, but there are huge consequences of early maltreatment. So nearly 50% of the children who have been investigated by Child Protective Services, not the ones that are substantiated, so this is the 6 million number, nearly 50% of those are documented as exhibiting clinical levels of mental health symptoms. And then despite some popular myths, children don't just grow out of these problems. So we have, for example, a lot of research from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that has linked tons of physical and emotional psychopathology outcomes to these adverse childhood experiences. And just as one statistic, these experiences have been estimated to account for 50 to 78% of the risk for adult depression, suicide, drug, and alcohol abuse. So in my research, I've been really interested in trying to develop a brief intervention for maltreated preschool-age children in particular that is informed by basic research on mechanisms that facilitate child development and kind of build on protective factors that we're already aware of in maltreatment. And then also seeking to address this major gap in the literature. There are very few interventions that are targeted for the preschool age period in particular. And then of those that are out there, many of them tend to be rather long-term. And instead of being implemented or disseminated, only 2% of the parenting interventions that we see Child Protective Services actually utilizing are empirically supported. So they tend to refer parents to like didactic parenting classes instead of doing any intervention with the parent and child themselves. And so, given limitations on funds for Child Protective Services, I think we need to move towards interventions that are brief and that might be pretty easily disseminated. So building on research that we're already aware of protective factors in maltreatment, we know that a positive parental relationship is a huge protective factor against the effects of maltreatment. And then one aspect of this relationship that might be particularly amenable to change is parent-child communication. So training parents of maltreated children to improve their communication skills might actually form the basis of a useful intervention, especially given that we know that during infancy, maltreating moms engage in less verbal behavior. And this is also drawing upon a huge body of basic research from the developmental literature on the benefits of mother-child reminiscing. So within this literature, we know that reminiscing has a huge influence on child social, emotional, and cognitive functioning. In particular, a reminiscing style that is elaborative, where moms are able to ask children lots of open-ended questions, be descriptive about past experiences, and then also talk about the causes and consequences of children's emotions is hugely beneficial for child development. It's linked to better social and self-understanding in children, improved language and memory, and also improved parent-child relationships. And then in particular, reminiscing that includes a discussion of emotion. Being able to explain that emotion really is associated with improvement in children's emotion understanding and then subsequent coping strategies resulting in fewer internalizing and externalizing problems. What's even more exciting is that there's experimental evidence that you can teach moms how to be more elaborative in a very brief amount of time, so 4 to 6 sessions worth of training. And so training in elaborative reminiscing that includes this discussion of emotion seems to be developmentally sensitive and brief, and maybe especially relevant for maltreating families, given that we know they engage in less verbal interactions with their children during infancy. And research with school-age children has shown that maltreating moms are less likely to include discussion of emotion with their school-age children when they reminisce. So we developed an intervention that in our community is colloquially called the heart-to-heart intervention for these little heart-to-heart conversations we're trying to teach moms how to have. And basically, our goals were to teach moms to ask more open-ended questions, be more emotionally supportive during these reminiscing conversations, and to do that, they needed to be able to make more causal connections between children's experiences and their emotions. So how can we help kids understand their feelings? And we were hoping to see that this would improve child functioning in multiple domains, cognitively and emotionally, including child's memory, emotional understanding and regulation, and adjustment. So we had 44 families participate in this research. They were all recruited from the St. Joe County Department of Child Services, and all of the families involved had children who were 4 to 6 years of age. The maltreatment case was actually open at the moment, so mom mom's maltreatment had been substantiated, was still working with DCS, and the child was still living at home in her care. The design of the study, all the families came in for a pre-lab assessment, and at this point we had asked them to reminisce about past experiences. Moms picked 4 past events to discuss with her child, and then they were randomized into either an intervention or waitlist control group, and then they came back to the lab and did this reminiscing again. And then at that point, the control condition was offered the intervention if they were interested. And so basically what we did was have these 4 in-home sessions. Each lasted about an hour. We were trying to teach caregivers 3 primary skills. And then we taught them this in a variety of ways. They saw a training video. They did a lot of practicing in session. So they were asked to reminisce with their child in session, and we videotaped it. And then moms watched the videotape of themselves doing the reminiscing back with the family coach. So they received immediate feedback. And then in between sessions, they were asked to practice and with a digital recorder, and the start of the next session then began with reviewing that practice session and giving feedback again. This is just an example of one of the handouts from the intervention, where you can see that we're asking them, teaching them to ask these open-ended questions, build on what children are saying, add descriptions, and then really emphasize this last piece about communicating feelings. So being able to label emotions that kids experienced, describe how did they know that their child felt that way, and then how did they get over it. So can we help resolve these feelings for kids? And so just briefly, I'll show you what we have found. And looking at the maternal side, could we teach mom to be more elaborative and emotionally supportive? And I think that we have preliminary evidence that we did. So the hashed bars are the intervention group, and the solid is the control group. And you can see that, in terms of maternal elaborative questions, from the pre-test to the post-test, moms who are in the intervention asked many more elaborative questions. That was a trend that didn't quite reach significance. But in terms of looking at their emotion attributions, so were they able to say during reminiscing, like, I think you felt certain ways, so labeling children's emotions for them, we did find a significant difference there. We also found a significant difference for emotion explanations, so not just being able to bring up a child emotion, but then to do something to explain why. So you felt this way because. And then on the child side, we found that children were making significantly more of their own unique contributions to the memory conversation. So they were remembering more of what happened and able to volunteer more information. And they made many, many more emotion references of their own. So they were able to talk about their own emotions spontaneously, indicate how they felt, not just necessarily in response to what mom was saying. So, so in terms of what this pilot study taught us, we think this intervention is feasible. I should have mentioned that of the 44 families that enrolled, we were able to have 40 complete the intervention, so very few were lost to attrition during that time. And we see, this preliminary evidence for improvements both in maternal, elaborative style and discussion of children's emotions and explanations, and also, child memory and ability to reference emotions, which we know, tends to be predictive of children's subsequent coping skills and emotion regulation. So the next steps for this research are to really be able to look at this in a longitudinal randomized clinical trial. So it would be ideal to look and see if we can see these improvements in child functioning in multiple domains. Are they sustained in the long term, not just immediately in the context of reminiscing, but just more broadly? And then if that is the case, what are the mechanisms of effect? And so, one thing that we're very interested in looking at is the role of mother and child stress physiology in all of this. So I will stop there and just wanted to acknowledge all of my collaborators and students and staff that have helped to conduct all of this research. Thank you. Questions?
Hi, I'm Kelly Lee. I work with families in the WIC program in Michigan with breastfeeding support. And so these are very young families who are on assistance for nutrition. I'm wondering, because I've struggled over the years in communicating these types of things to low-income families, how you were able to persuade them in the intervention piece that this was a good idea, that they communicate this way. And if you think it's because they were kind of a captive audience, because they were under threat of having their children taken away, because I find it difficult, they perceive this kind of treatment of their children to be coddling, and they don't want to engage in that. So they're very rejecting of these kinds of behaviors. So I wonder what you think of that.
Well, I will say that for these families in particular, although DCS helped us identify them, they weren't involved and they didn't mandate families to participate. So on the bright side, they did sort of buy in. But I do hear what you're saying in terms of it being difficult. One of the challenges, I think, in our initial sessions with families actually is when we're having them reminisce, is to get parents to not pick a time where their child misbehaved and use it as an opportunity to lecture. And so that's why that emotional piece is so important in getting parents to think about and be able to talk about their child's emotions and how they felt. And I think that as we've convinced parents to do that a little bit more, we've helped shift their thinking a little bit instead of just evaluating their behavior and then being focused on needing to discipline them for that behavior, and taking a step back and thinking about how did they feel before they engaged in that behavior, and can that shift their understanding of what happened. So rather than needing to be punitive, maybe they understood that their child was scared in that moment, and then they reacted in a negative way. I will say, though, that it is very difficult to get these families to buy in, and I think that that's one of the reasons that we've been using this video feedback procedure, and we intentionally spend a lot of the time in the intervention not highlighting the things that they didn't do, but trying to find moments that they can see on the video where they did do things correctly and praise them for that. Because they have a lot of people coming into their lives telling them that they've done things wrong. And if we do that as well, then we're not going to get them to continue to participate. So, I think breaking it down into a couple of simple messages and then praising them as they do that have been kind of key to facilitating parent motivation.
Other questions? Comments?
Hi, I'm Ruth Lanius. I'm from the University of Western Ontario in Canada. Thanks for your talk, Kristin, and the really important work you're doing. I'm just wondering whether you could comment a little bit on the age range of the children in the intervention you use, and also maybe reflect on prenatal interventions as as a possibility. Certainly what I see clinically a lot, this manifests already prenatally, some of these problems.
Yeah, so we've targeted the preschool age in particular because, well, for a couple of reasons. One, because there are very few interventions that are targeting that age specifically, and that's the age where most of the reminiscing literature has emanated from, so that we know if we teach moms these things, that this is the prime age to be able to start seeing child participation and engagement in them. And then given our goal of wanting to do things in a more brief intervention that might not be so daunting for DCS to actually implement, that was part of our reasoning in thinking about the preschool age period. But certainly the types of things that moms are struggling with, they come into that parent-child relationship with, well before the child's actually born. And so I think many of these things could be geared towards preventive interventions. Obviously, they're not already identified as having maltreatment experiences, but identifying women during pregnancy. We're actually doing some work right now where we're looking at the trauma histories of pregnant women at WIC and St. Joe, and seeing how that relates to basic child development, basic measures of cognitive and emotional development within the first years of life, and also predicting birth outcomes, because we have some pretty poor infant birth statistics in St. Joe in particular. So a lot of very low birth weight babies, a lot of stillborns and a lot of ethnic disparities in that. And so one of the things that we are interested in is looking at whether we can identify some moms during pregnancy for being at high risk for some of these things, and then what might we be able to do prenatally to avert the possibility or the risk for subsequent maltreatment.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, I was at ISIS earlier this year, which is the Infancy, International Conference of Infancy Studies, and in past years it hadn't occurred to me to look, but this year I looked and there was almost nothing about maltreatment at that conference, and I was really surprised. And I'm curious if as a community we can start to make this issue more present in more of the conferences, or if there are plans to do that. I think it was very much missing. There was one presentation that I identified that was about maltreatment. And so I think the work with younger children is very important because they're most vulnerable, but it was completely missing. And so I'm curious if you have any plans to present, or if we could get a group of folks together who would do that sort of thing at the next infancy conference. Just more a comment than anything else.
Yeah, I do think maltreatment research in infancy is somewhat rare. Part of the problem is identifying young children within the first 12 months of age who have had maltreatment experiences. And so for this study, we were able to identify families that were already in the system because of maltreatment for another child, and used family-level maltreatment classifications to look at these different subtypes, because most of the maltreatment that will occur during infancy will then result in that child being removed from the home and placed in foster care. I mean, if your child has dramatic physical evidence of abuse as a 6-month-old, they're not going to let that infant stay in maternal care. But that being said, I am interested in looking at potential downward extensions of especially this reminiscing-based intervention, because there is evidence that you can teach moms these skills as young as when their infants are 9 to 18 months of age, and that you'll still see benefits down the road. So I think trying to establish some solid data to justify doing that first with this age group where we're more likely to see the improvements is a necessary first step, but certainly interested in looking at downward extensions too.
Hi, Carla Lyons-Ruth from Harvard Medical School. Kristin, I thought it was just lovely how you first tried to look at some of these developmental milestones in social engagement with the parent, and then sort of stepped off of that to the intervention. I think that we are really lacking in, and you would sort of know this literature best, in really tracing what the developmental impacts are on these emerging social milestones for the child. And we know that we have a lot of sort of outcomes at various points that are very bad, but we haven't traced the mechanisms and the processes very carefully yet. So I really was very taken with your trying to look at things like the early social referencing, pointing, initiating, and really getting at what is it in this early fabric that then begins to cascade into the kinds of disorders that we see by school age. So very nice work.
Thank you.
You might have mentioned it and I might have missed it with my little noisemaker over here. Were these individual or group interventions?
Individual. They were in-home individual interventions.
One thing that might help with compliance, I'm thinking possibly, because I live in an inner ring suburb of Cleveland, and we have, through the city and through the schools, we've had a couple of different things happen. One that's geared towards birth through preschool that was kind of an intervention, but it was open to everybody. And as somebody, as a sociologist, I was curious what was going on, so my family attended, and they had a meal. Both of them had a meal and childcare, and then time for the adults to talk, and then times to take what we talked about in the way of interventions and apply it with others seeing what we're doing, including the professional leaders. and then homework. This is your assignment for a week, and they were about 6-week programs. And there was a lot of diversity in the participants because it wasn't forced on us. There were people that were just there, allo-parenting for the win. But we had a very broad economic base coming in, different. Well, I mean, we didn't have any really high income, but we had very definitely comfortable middle class families and families on every form of government assistance and everywhere in between in these groups. And I think it was really good for us as parents to see what the other families are struggling with, and for, we gave each other hope at the same time that we went, okay, it's not, we're not doing perfect, but we're all improving and we're focused on improving. And I think that actually helped with compliance a lot. Yeah, and it's that maternal support feeding into the maternal, and there were a lot of fathers that participated too. So.
Yeah, I can certainly see the benefits of, having a more group environment. And I think one thing that we'll have to, evaluate or think about are the trade-offs in the individualized feedback versus, the morale building and motivation, and that maybe there's a, right balance or combination of the both, like after learning some individualized skills that, maybe having some check-in groups or things later. But I definitely think that that's a valuable perspective.
Thank you very much, Kristin. Well,